Do you think that morphogenetic fields contain within them and all of their possibilities a sort of ideal or overarching form of the same kind or similar to Socrates' idea of forms and the ideal form?
Well, the idea of morphogenetic fields is it is related to Plato's idea of ideal forms. But this afternoon I'm going to talk about the way these fields change in time. Plato had the idea that the universe is governed by ideal forms of things and that these are reflected in the world we live in. And these forms are beyond space and time. Aristotle was Plato's student, and he rejected Plato's idea of transcendent forms and said the forms of things are not outside nature, they're inside nature, and in fact they're within the souls of things. So he took the Platonic forms and embodied them within the souls of organisms. So instead of there being an ideal horse outside space and time that every horse reflects or participates in, he said the ideal form was in the soul of the horse, which is inside space and time and within and around actual horses. So there is a similarity, there is a kind of ancestry from Plato into these ideas through Aristotle. But what I'll show this afternoon is what I'm saying is that these forms evolve. They're not fixed in time. So it does differ from the Platonic idea, but there is a certain overlap. Let's have someone from that side. Yes.
In your remarks about the chaos, I understood to say, for example, that in understanding the behavior of the solar system, you've got some chaotic problems. Now, but I always thought that was because it was a thermodynamically open system. Does their chaos theory apply when the system is closed, thermodynamically isolated?
I'm not sure. I think the solar system is chaotic partly because even in terms of classical mechanics, there's still no solution for the many-bodied problem. Classical mechanics can handle two bodies interacting. But if you have the so-called three-body problem, or especially the many-body problem, you can't get exact solutions. That's part of the problem in the solar system. But people who are trying to model the dynamics of the solar system over the long term have found that they do better with chaotic dynamics, which is a special branch of mathematics, than they do with trying to do it by classical physics with approximations to deal with the many-body problem. I don't think it's anything to do with thermodynamics as such. But there is another branch of inquiry at the moment that's relevant to this, which is the kind of work done by Ilya Prigogine, which is to do with open systems far from thermodynamic equilibrium, where he shows that these all sorts of things can happen. They're highly unstable sometimes, and a tiny perturbation can make a huge difference. And of course, most real-life systems are open systems thermodynamically, not closed systems. In fact, closed systems are a kind of artificial abstraction that hardly occurs in nature. Yes, the lady here.
In the light of what you said on Thursday, but also this morning, I'm just wondering whether you would want to share with us any personal theory of mind. What is mind?
Well, that's in less than 2 minutes. Well, it's hard to give an instant answer because we have to think about what words mean. I think personally, I like the word psyche, the traditional word for the soul. And I think the basis of psychology is the psyche, as the word implies. Psychology is the study of the psyche. But because of the problem about what the word soul means that I described this morning, because of this historical confusion, what happened, you see, with Descartes said that there's no such thing as the soul, there's just the rational mind. And the rational mind, by definition, was conscious. Then, after Descartes, people came along and said, well, an awful lot of human behavior doesn't seem very rational, and not all of it seems to be conscious. And so then they invented the unconscious mind. Freud is the most famous person who put forward the idea of the unconscious, and Jung took it further. But even in the 18th century, people were saying that there must be more to the mind than just the conscious mind. So the concept of the mind then becomes more complicated. You've got the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and no one knows how far the unconscious mind reaches. Freud thought it was a personal part of the brain activity, which he was a materialist, that it was part of the brain activity below consciousness. And since consciousness was in the cerebral cortex, the assumption was this was lower down in the brain. But then Jung said, it's not just personal, it's the collective unconscious. And this may stretch out even beyond the human realm and contact with nature. So the unconscious becomes a rather undefined concept. And that's still part of this word mind. So then some people say, well, we don't mean mind, we want the word consciousness. But then again, you run into the same problem, because so much of the mind is unconscious. It doesn't make sense to say unconscious consciousness. So I think it's much clearer to think in terms of the psyche, which is largely unconscious, which is Aristotle thought and St. Thomas Aquinas thought. No one thought the mind was all conscious in the past. So I think the mind is we can use it as a general term to cover the psyche, including the unconscious. When we come to consciousness and what the specific role of consciousness is, I think consciousness is primarily concerned with choosing among possibilities. Consciousness inhabits the realm of possibility. And what we have in our minds is a vast plethora of possibility. Principally, our consciousness, I think, is concerned with possible actions. It's mainly directed towards action. And when you're trying to decide what to say, where to go, what to do, you consider all these alternatives, and then you choose among those. So it's a bit like in quantum theory. You've got a field of possibility, and then choice involves one rather than all the others. So I think that's what's happening. Now, when it comes to higher consciousness in mystical experience, that's another thing altogether. And I think there are higher levels of consciousness beyond the human level. Just as in the morphic fields, you've got layers of organization, I think there are forms of consciousness beyond ours, many levels of consciousness beyond ours. And I think sometimes in mystical experience we can link to them and become part of them. So I think the conscious mind is to do with choice and possibility, embedded in the larger unconscious mind, which is largely to do with habits, which we don't have to think about. Habits happen unconsciously. And then our consciousness is open to other forms of consciousness at higher levels than ours. So that's 5 minutes. But yes.
Some physical healers, similar like Jesus, they would use prayer and spoken word to heal.
Yes.
Can you? I've worked with Cora Kuhn's on the therapy test. I can sort of visualize that. But it's hard for me to visualize the spoken word and how that actually manifests into somebody's cancer, going on. Jesus did, according to the Bible, did very quickly. Some people prayer takes longer. Can you sort of describe that process?
Yes. Well, I don't think that spoken words are necessary, because a lot of healers work without words, and indeed in the Bible Jesus did it too. The woman who touched his robe and was healed of the flow of blood, and he felt the power go out of it, the Bible, go out of him, the power, the Bible says. That was wordless healing. And so I don't think words are essential, and I think insofar as they play a part, they act as a way of formulating an intention or a thought. But I don't think a word is a key feature of many forms of healing, although it can play a part. I think maybe forming an intention is part of it, but even then, some of it may happen. In the case of Jesus and the woman touching his robe, he wasn't even forming an intention specifically to heal that woman. He didn't know it had happened till it had happened. I haven't myself worked on healing in any detail. I mean, I'm interested in it, but I don't have any specific ideas as to exactly the relative parts of intention, general intention, specific words, and so on might play. At the back.
Yes, your use of the term field sometimes confuses me, because I think in terms of Maxwell's equations and other classical physics conceptions of the field,
Yes.
These equations all involve some kind of space and time description. And Einstein's equations are the same way. But morphogenetic fields, as I understand them and how you use them, are non-attenuating in nature. That is, they seem to manifest across time without any kind of effect from distance between objects. And so I'm wondering if you've ever given thought to the idea that these fields may be field-like, but actually outside of space-time, not really fields at all, but something that looks a lot like fields when they manifest in our world.
Yes, well, I mean, it's true that what I'm talking about are different from the fields as described in physics textbooks. But there's a difference between the mathematical models of fields, which is what you get in textbooks, and what those models are supposed to refer to. The reason Faraday interests me so much is that he had a concept of fields before Maxwell's equations. I mean, there's no doubt that Faraday invented the field concept in science and developed it. But he didn't think in terms of equations. That was a mathematical model that came later, and it turned out it was, in a way, a false model because it was based on the ether, which doesn't exist. So it was an imaginary, based on an imaginary mechanism, namely vortices in the ether and so on. So it's important to distinguish between the mathematical model and what the model's referring to. In the case of morphogenetic fields, people have actually tried to make models of them. The main models, mathematical models, are due to René Thom, the French topologist. And he modeled the fields in terms of dynamics. So the field would draw systems towards an attractor, and the attractor is modeled in a multidimensional phase space. So insofar as there are mathematical models of morphogenetic fields, they're dynamical models with multidimensional phase spaces. Now, the trouble is most people can't follow that kind of maths, so it doesn't really help in conceiving of them. But there are mathematical models for those who are into maths. They can be modeled mathematically. What I'm suggesting is that the fields are local. They're within and around the system they organize. My field is within and around me, rooted in my body, and if it reaches out through my mind, it's still rooted in my body. It's not non-local or non-spatial. The thing that's non-spatial in my hypothesis, which I'll talk about this afternoon, is morphic resonance. That's where you can have an influence from one field system to another across space and time. So I'm not suggesting the fields are non-local. They're localized in and around the systems they're organizing, just like magnetic fields are. The models that you give to these fields may be in more than the normal 3 dimensions, but that's pretty standard in physics now. All dynamics is based on multidimensional phase spaces, and so is quantum theory. And when things are linked by a particular field, say you have when this field theory is applied to phenomena like telepathy, which I described in my lecture on Thursday, if you have members of a social group, an animal group, a flock of birds, a school of fish, or a dog bonded to an owner, they're part of a social field that includes all the members of the group. When one goes away from the other, they retain a non-local connection, so a change in one can affect the other. That's like quantum non-locality. And quantum non-locality doesn't have a distance dependence. When you have particles that move apart, that were part of the same system, they retain this non-local connection or non-separable connection at any distance, even if they're moving apart at the speed of light, when you have 2 photons moving apart. So if they're part of the same system, in other words, part of the same field of the original system, which is then separated, there is a non-local connection between them that doesn't fall off with distance. That's what I'm saying happens when you have members of a social group that are separated in distance. There is a non-local, non-distance dependent field, but it doesn't mean the field is beyond all space and time. It means there's a non-local connection which is still within space and time, but which doesn't fall off with distance. So that's where you're talking about relationships between 2 parts of the same system. Morphic resonance is different. That's a transfer of information from one system to another over space and time.
How do you spell Thom's last name? René Thom?
He died recently. He won the Fields Medal and was a very famous mathematician in France, and devoted quite a lot of his time to trying to model morphogenesis. He wrote a book called Structural Stability and Morphogenesis, and another one called Mathematical Models of Morphogenesis, which are really to do with field models, morphogenetic field models. I give the references in my books. In The Presence of the Past, you can find the full bibliographic reference. The question is, can you use the mathematics of fractals to describe these fields? For some of them you can, but most, the mathematics of the kinds of fractals most people are familiar with are self-similar fractals, where you have the same pattern repeated at different levels. Not all fractals are self-similar, and not all biological systems are self-similar. Some are, like branching patterns in trees, have a self-similar fractal pattern. And you get it too in vein patterns in leaves. You get branches off the main vein, and then you have branches off these side veins, and then branches off those. So you could, for this kind of situation, fractal models might be quite helpful. And in fact, you can make computer models of tree branching or leaf vein structure using fractal models. But for other things, it's not the case. I mean, our whole body is not a kind of fractal magnification of a cell or of any of our tissues. So it's only in certain cases that they can work. Yes?
I was wondering, you mentioned Jung. What's the relationship between your theories and Jung's collective consciousness, for example?
Well, I'll come back to that this afternoon, but Jung thought that all of us draw upon a collective unconscious, which is a kind of collective memory. And so it really refers to the whole question of memory and how it works, which is one of the themes I'll touch on this afternoon. But there's quite a strong similarity between what I'm saying and what Jung's saying. He was talking about human psychology and about human memory. And I'm talking about the way the whole of nature works. And I think that every species has a kind of collective memory, as I'll show this afternoon. So Jung's theory would be a special case of what I would treat as a more general theory. And if the collective unconscious as a collective memory didn't exist in Jung's theory, it would have to be invented from the point of view of what I'm saying. They fit together very well. This lady.
Yes, I'm missing something. Aristotle talks about the vegetative soul. And
Yes.
He said it had the organizing concept in that soul, which was the primal animal or plant. I'm not quite sure what the organizing principle would mean if I narrow it down to animals and plants. And how does that, I know it translates up further to the intellectual.
Yes.
What's the big difference there in that organizing?
Well, Aristotle said that the vegetative soul of a plant, say of an oak tree, organizes the form, the shape of the tree, and organizes the growing seedling so that it takes up the leaves and the flowers and so on, grow in the right way. It provides like an invisible mold. And what's more, this invisible mold draws the developing seedling towards it, which is why if you cut a bit off it, it will regenerate and still look like a regular oak tree. If you cut the top off a pine tree, then one of the leading shoots will bend around and it'll soon look like a proper pine tree again.
We lose that as we come up to the intellectual, so we don't have, like, the newt can do it, but we can't. Somewhere in between there.
Well, we all have regenerative capacities, although we have less than the newt. But we can regenerate our skin, which is when you cut yourself, it regenerates. The liver can regenerate. The blood is constantly regenerated. So in our bodies, there's still quite a lot of regeneration going on. Wound healing is an example. And when it comes to behavior or animal behavior, very often it behaves in a similar way. You have an end or a goal, which in modern dynamics is modeled in terms of an attractor. You see, Aristotle said souls work by attraction. They attract towards a goal. Modern dynamics in modern mathematical models say morphogenetic fields work by attractors, OR at the end, attractor, and they draw things towards an end or a goal. There's a kind of attraction to an end or a goal. And in behavior, this happens. So if a dog wants to get to a bone, it'll just go straight there. If you put a barrier in the way, it'll go round the barrier. It'll still get to the bone, but it might have to use different means of getting there. So it's as if the goal is what draws it towards it. And we're the same. You know, if we're trying to get home and the road's blocked, then you find a different way from the usual one until you can get to the goal that you want to achieve. So a great deal of human behavior is goal-directed, and not just human behavior, but animal behavior too. And in a sense, you could say this regenerative behavior of animals and plants is also goal-directed. They know where they're trying to get, as it were, and if they can't get there the normal way, they get there an unusual way. Like the eye of the newt regenerating a lens. It's doing it in an unusual way, but it's getting back to the whole form of the eye.